Together webinar series. Thank you for joining us on this very weather exciting day. I'm sure many of you have heard that locally here we have faced Tropical Storm Zelda, so I'm glad everyone is safe, and we understand that there's some power that is out and schools are canceled, but we are persevering and showing a certain sense of resilience by sharing this webinar with you this morning, and are really excited by the topic. This topic is the future of workforce, and we're co-hosting it with the Atlanta International Global Studies Center, as well as the Mayor's Office of International Affairs. Vanessa?
Well, good morning, everyone. It's so great to join you all here today. First and foremost, I hope everyone is safe. I hope nobody was terribly impacted by the storm here. And I also want to thank everyone for your resilience in joining us here today, despite the many challenges. I think what we've learned from 2020 is that we're very resilient, and we're really able to continue to roll with the punches and everything that comes at us throughout this year. So at the Mayor's Office of International Affairs, of course, we always have an interest around the future of work, more importantly, a global workforce. And so I'm very excited for today's timely conversation, to have these great panelists that are going to be able to talk to us about the future of education, the future of the workspace, the future of work. And so this is an incredible opportunity for us to really come together, because indeed we are smarter together. So thank you, Deborah, thank you, Georgia Tech, and thank you to our panelists and audience for joining us here today.
Yeah, and what makes this great is thanks to the Mayor's Office, we brought together an international group of experts and practitioners and researchers. And so I'll let each panelist introduce themselves, but the reason why we put them together is that they represent how multifaceted the future of work is. You know, it doesn't rest in any one single discipline or silo, and it really comes from space, research, and practice. And so you'll really hear that come together during this panel. But without further ado, let me have each of the panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll have some questions. And let me remind the virtual audience that feel free to type your questions on the event chat or in the Q&A. We'll certainly take those towards the end, and feel free to join in the conversation. So let me start with Mohammed.
Great. Good morning. Thank you for that, Deborah. I'm Mohammed Abdul-Kader. I'm the Executive Director of the Stevens Initiative at the Aspen.
Wonderful. Stephen?
Thanks, Deborah. I'm Steve Harmon. I'm the Interim Executive Director of the Center for 21st Century Universities at Georgia Tech. I'm also the Associate Dean of Research in Georgia Tech Professional Education and a Professor of Industrial Design.
Ray?
Hi, I'm Ray Gastel. I direct the Remaking Cities Institute at Carnegie Mellon and the School of Architecture, and more broadly with the university, and have worked a lot of my career as a city planning director.
And then Felix.
Hello, everybody. My name is Felix Steltner. I'm a New York-based German journalist, and I apologize for my surroundings here as I am joining you from a car, currently from Germany, where the weather is equally bad. So I hope the connection is okay, and I'm very, very glad and honored to be part of this conversation today.
All right, so that is our four distinguished panelists. We kept the introductions fairly brief, because we want to make sure that we have ample room for discussion and conversation. So I'm tag teaming this webinar today with Vanessa, so we'll go back and forth a little bit on the questions, but let me kick it off first to Vanessa.
Perfect. Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, everyone, for your quick introductions. So the first question is to Mohammed. So as I mentioned earlier in my introduction, we at the Office of International Affairs and our various partners are very interested in building a global workforce. And as I mentioned, in order to have a global workforce, you have to have a globally minded workforce. And that starts from kindergarten, 12th grade, technical college, so on and so forth. Prior to the pandemic, there were already conversations about virtual educational exchanges. As we know, not everybody has the opportunity to study abroad, but we want to be able to bring that opportunity. So with that said, with the pandemic, we have seen, and we did have an event in February around the future of work, and it has certainly, the conversation has changed a lot since then. So the question to you is, as during the pandemic, everyone has shifted to a virtual platform and looking at virtual educational exchanges, you have been doing that with the Stevens Initiative. What are some of the takeaways that you've gotten from these virtual educational exchanges? What are some lessons learned that you would like to share with those that are now getting into that platform? And do you think this is going to be the new normal, or just one more tool in the international educational toolkit?
Great, thanks. Great question, Vanessa. So I'll be brief with my answer, but I'll say just a couple of quick reflections that yes, some form of hybrid learning is going to be the case, I think, for all of us for the foreseeable future, for the young people that may be watching at home today, and for the parents who are watching. For those of you who don't know, the Stevens Initiative focuses on building the field of virtual exchange. So we're essentially getting two classrooms in different parts of the world connected for collaborative online learning experiences where young people are learning about one another, so across cultures, across borders, but then they're also collaborating with one another and learning with each other in a various subjects. So we have funded programs in STEM, business, social studies, different subjects. Again, for us, it's really about the cross-cultural connection and really building that global competence. So a couple of quick observations in terms of the skills that are necessary that I think are going to be required for young people going forward. They really fall into two buckets. The first one is really not a surprise, and that is going to be around tech savviness. So technology is now going to be the way that we connect. It's going to fulfill, it's going to be our lifeline to groceries and getting goods delivered to our homes in some cases. In other cases, it's going to be how we connect with loved ones and find community. And it's also going to be how we learn. So there is going to be a degree of tech literacy that is necessary for all of us going forward. And unfortunately, given the tech equity gap, unfortunately, a lot of kids are going to be left behind. So it's something for cities, for administrators, for university officials to continue to keep in mind that not everyone has access to broadband. Not everyone is going to have access to hardware that's going to enable them to stay online. So that's sort of the first bucket of skills. The second is really going to be around global competence. And global competence is a broad set of skills that are going to allow you to really connect the dots around the world and understand the world that we live in, to connect with peers across borders and be able to communicate with them and collaborate with them, and then ultimately act on those data points. So I want to just sort of give you a couple of examples. On connecting the dots, this is really about analytical thinking, right? The world is certainly complex. We are now in an environment where, within weeks, a pandemic, a virus that started in one part of the world found itself on our shores and disrupted our whole way of life. So young people have to be able to connect the dots, engage in analytical thinking. Now, part of this analytical thinking is also going to be data literacy. We're in an age of misinformation. So I think educators have to think a little bit more about how we address these issues of fundamentally understanding data sets, making sense of them, and really cutting through what may not be accurate. And this is really important, obviously, for our shared security, for the health of our democracy, for global business. For a number of reasons, this is important. The second part of global competence is going to be the communicating and collaborating across borders. Sometimes that's going to be in English, sometimes it's not. My team at the Stevens Initiative is scattered amongst 11 time zones. We span from Seattle to Abu Dhabi. And you're going to have this. Young people are going to have to navigate the time zones. They're going to have to potentially navigate, again, nonverbal cues that are coming from people overseas, teams that are distributed when you're in the workforce from around the world, and technologies like Zoom or Google Hangouts enable us to have teams that are distributed around the world. So that's something to think about. Certainly that makes it a lot more competitive as you're entering the workforce. So you're not just competing with the kids who are coming out of your high school. You're really competing on a global scale now. So we have to think about our global competitiveness as well. And then finally, another important piece of this is going to be acting on that information that you get. As I mentioned earlier, this is part of global citizenship, right? You have to be able to act. And what I want to also really underscore with the global citizenship piece is this isn't just for young people who are going to go study abroad, young people who are going to go work in London for a few years. What I really want to underscore is the connection between the global and the local, that the United States is part of the global community, like it or not, nationalism or not. We are impacted by climate change. We're impacted by the global economy. We're certainly impacted by things, global health issues like a pandemic. So these skills have to be underscored in our curriculum as we're educating our young people. We have to make sure, so in terms of lessons learned, these things have to be emphasized in the way we teach. We have to make sure that our young people are able to sift through data, that they are able to communicate, sometimes not in English, which underscores, I know, Vanessa, you've got an interest in world languages. So those kinds of skills are incredibly important. Now, in terms of findings and things that we have seen through the Stevens Initiative, we have seen that virtual exchange programs can indeed have an impact on young people's knowledge of the other. We've seen some statistically significant differences in the programs that we have supported, which is exciting to see. We have also seen some impact on their ability to communicate and collaborate across borders. So that's exciting. We're continuing to look into that data to help with program design with the partners that we support. I would also encourage folks to check out the OECD PISA exam. They last week actually released a data set from the 2018 exam, which really focused a bit of its findings on global competence. And it showed the link between young people who are engaging in programs in their school that focus on global competence, so really try to infuse a global perspective, how that influenced attitudes, and ultimately how those attitudes influenced their behavior, their action. We are in an environment where, for those of you who are in Atlanta, you were just impacted by a massive storm. There's obviously in Louisiana, and our thoughts are with everyone who was impacted. But more and more, we're going to need everyone to act on these data sets because, frankly, our survival as a species may depend on it. So I just want to sort of highlight a couple of those points. And the final piece is going to be the flexibility around all of this, that our young people entering the workforce who are in school are, frankly, just going to have to be flexible. There will be more disruptions, unfortunately, from things like pandemic, disruptions from, hopefully not, civil unrest, changes to our life due to climate change and perhaps forced migration. Ray was talking about that earlier. And our workforce just has to be malleable to connect with folks from all over the world. So I'll pause my comments there and we can take any more in Q&A.
Thank you, Mohammed. And you bring some excellent points when it comes to the interconnectedness, when it comes to security, when it comes to just the global workforce and our survival as a species. It's very important at this time for us to really come together. So Deborah, I'm going to kick it off to you now.
Yeah, Mohammed, just a quick question, a follow-up question before I turn to Dr. Harmed, obviously we very much agree with what you're saying around tech equity and the health of democracy, especially when it comes to global relations. But what do you say to the critics that might say we have to focus on basic skills, mathematics, reading? We have, basic needs to provide for our kids, like even subsidized reduced lunches and breakfasts. There's a lot of foundational education that needs to be provided for our young children, and that we don't have the resources, the capacity, the capability to think about these other issues on top of that.
Sure, it's a great question. We face this all the time. Luckily, global competence can be embedded in any subject, right? Because if you're studying science and you're studying something like the environment, well, that's not just a Georgia issue. That's not just a Tennessee issue. That is a global issue, and it affects us. So you can infuse, as an educator, that global lens and the global perspective into whatever subject that you're looking at. You can contextualize it. Not that difficult. The other part that I would say is, with whatever issue that we are dealing with, you have to be able to communicate that data. You have to be able to communicate your findings cross-border, and that is a fundamental part of global competence. So it doesn't have to be separate. Skills can be integrated into your existing subjects, like reading, like math, like science. You can always infuse this global perspective to get young people to see that we are connected in this global community.
Dr. Harmon, this is a nice segue to you. You obviously lead the Center for 21st Century Education. First of all, can you tell me a little bit about what that means, 21st century education, and also how it relates to on-the-ground work, some of the things that Mohammed was talking about, but also some of the recent projects that you have been doing, especially around reskilling and, the different life stages of education?
glad to, Deborah. And by the way, I'm one of the ones without any power right now, so I'm hoping my glued together technology holds in there.
It's working thus far, so please continue.
Great. The Center for 21st Century Universities we've realized that higher education has changed a good bit. If we look at students coming into Georgia Tech right now, in AP classes, so they come in as a sophomore. So we've realized that a lot of their higher education starts before they ever get to Georgia Tech. So we're taking an increasing interest in the K-12 system and building those folks up. The C21U is what we call the center. It's really a think tank. We really look at factors that we think are influencing education and figure out how we position ourselves to agree with the global nature of education.
Steve, it seems that's lagging a little bit. I don't know if there's a way for you to maybe just call in.
We're connected. Did you lose me?
It's freezing up here. It's lagging.
Let me do that. I'll pop out and just call back in on the phone, and we'll try that.
Yes, I think that's best.
Perfect. And obviously, what I'll do in the interim is I'll go straight to Ray, but I also have the Center for 21st Century Education website on the chat box. So feel free to reach out and visit that website to learn more. And then, of course, Steve can log back in and tell you a little bit more. But Ray, you are now at Carnegie Mellon University. Before that, you were the director of planning, city planning at the city of Pittsburgh. So what makes you think that, or why are you in this panel about the future of work, I guess, is the starting point, given your background? Why is a designer, an architect, a planner interested in the future of work?
That's a great question, Deborah. Thank you, and I will answer it. One of the main reasons that, urban design, one of the things it's always involved in is the street, the sidewalks, the edge of the buildings, that, sometimes called the public realm, right? And I think that today, when we're looking at both COVID and just accelerating trends that were already there, is that area is an area that the work has really just begun. Because that is, first of all, it's a workplace. Like we sort of constantly preoccupied with workplaces that are inside office buildings or R&D buildings and so forth as we think about tech. But actually, there's a tech workforce of a kind relying on the tools that tech has provided that is doing deliveries, drop-offs, and also then there's folks it's a workplace for the hundreds of thousands of servers working at restaurants and similar establishments in this country. And so when we think about it, we are trying to figure out a way that this space can be shared and safer. Now, there are entities like NACTO, which sets our sort of street design guidelines, and certain cities and so forth have done various strategies about slow streets and so forth to try and accommodate some of this, loosening some regulations about how sidewalks are used, all in a kind of temporary mode. But it's a long-term mode about changing the way we think about the workplace. And that, because again, the sidewalk is a workplace. When it gets to what's inside the buildings, I'd note two things. There's a type of tenant, which when we talk about tech's impact, sometimes it's spatial and not necessarily about the algorithms, but more about, well, they are algorithms in terms of decisions about where to locate, but it's the location of these spaces. I've noted that we see that the kind of co-working spaces that are urban design question themselves. The co-working space that's opened in my neighborhood recently and that is already at 50%, even though it's actually, these are hard times, They clearly believe that everything about their business depends on their relationship to the street. They open up and have bands play, and they have lemonade stands during COVID. They have lemonade stands, but it's because they're working every day to figure out how we can, have this sort of shared spaces that are safe. And that's part of the work they do in their inside and their interiors. Many of the rules have changed about how to do that, but there's a lot of work being done on that as well. Imagine, not so long ago, we thought it was terrific that we were lowering the cubicle dividers because it provided natural light, and you could actually get LEED points for that, and sort of in a larger sustainable model. Today, you got to think about raising those back up, for example. Similarly, I think in a shared working space, I suspect that the premium, there's a greater interest in the private offices than there used to be, than the shared desk, or than the desk station. So that, I'd have to look at that. You need numbers to tell that story. Finally, one other thing I want to say about this is related to health in a very specific way. Because, when we were knocking around ideas for this, you had mentioned the Sustainable Development Guidelines from the UN for sustainable cities, speaking of a global perspective on this. And I'd also add in the health one, which is, health and well-being, which is number 3, the community is number 11. And the other thing I'd add in is when Thomas Frieden spoke about in his sort of health impact pyramid, which he developed in 2010 after his work at the CDC and his work in New York, he said, make individuals healthy, default decisions healthy, right? So that your default decisions are healthy in all kinds of environments. And that's an urban design question. And that's also the interior of a co-working space question. And so when you ask why architecture and urban design are kind of involved in this topic, or planning is involved in this, is because we got to think about these environments, because all the trends in terms of the type of work that we do and the type of goods delivery we do and so forth all depend on creating environments which are going to be safer and more equitable ultimately. There's a few other points, but we can leave it for the Q&A.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the UN SDGs, actually. I just put it on the event chat as well. Georgia Tech has been doing a lot in leading the university's push on UN SDGs and what does it look like from the university's perspective. And President Cabrera has actually tried to incorporate it as part of his strategic plan. So it is very much first and foremost in our planning stages. But you mentioned a couple of things, obviously, that the changes in space, especially given the pandemic, and the changes in traffic. Obviously, we've seen some changes in air quality with less traffic or fewer traffic. But what is there to say that these changes in space, especially to accommodate for the changes of workforce, are temporary, and that once we go back to a vaccine, space will revert back to its original form, especially with the workforce and us going back to the office in that traditional manner? How does space adapt or evolve, or do you see that happening?
Well, yes, some of it will go back to where it was, but I don't think all of it will. One, because I think these are trends that were already there. I think people have recognized that there's environments which are actually safe for people walking around, which is really, we've been working on this for 50 years, if not forever, trying to have environments where, the vehicles moving people do not endanger the lives of the people who are getting out of those vehicles or walking who are already there. If we try, these types of communities are one which is not just in the coastal cities, it's actually a national trend to try and figure out ways that people can live cooperatively in these areas and share the spaces more safely. And that's a street design, that's a enforcement, that's a technological challenge. And I think people are not going to go back from that. I also think this business of people spending more time outside, which, is, again, kind of an emergency situation. But, think of it. We've got buildings and sidewalks. Either we go big and get more open, or we seal everything in boxes and hope we have really good air filters. The reality is we kind of have to do both. We have to have, sealed buildings with really, really good filters and good fresh air supply. But at the same time, I think for so many reasons, social, cultural, health, opening the windows and opening the doors, and those, literally buildings becoming more physically open, dwellings having more porches, all that kind of stuff, sort of a return to early 20th century models rather than mid 20th century models, is something people have gotten some waves of interest in over the last few decades. And I think they're going to be more interested in now because there's also a health imperative to it. I know there is a strong rationale. Also, once people realize that you can sit outside when it's 50 degrees, you'd be surprised that it changes the way they see the street because people are spending more time in their neighborhoods, right? And if you're spending more time in your neighborhoods, you're going to start thinking a lot harder about what it's like to move around your neighborhood, not just when you drive to another center or a workspace or a shopping center. You're going to think more about that neighborhood and more about people are seeing more about what it means. Now, has this translated to people driving slower on streets through business districts or neighborhood districts? That's the statistics I'd like to see. But I still think it has changed the mentality about it for people, and I think those changes will happen.
Steve, have you been able to dial back in?
I am in. I can hear
Oh, perfect. Yes, I just unmuted you. So perfect.
Oh, okay.
We can hear you now.
Sorry about that. Great.
So this is perfect. So this is a very good example of us being resilient as well with different options. And I'm glad you were able to join back on the phone with us. Just to follow up, obviously Ray put forth a pretty compelling case in terms of how space and design is going to change with the future of workforce, and a lot driven by health, but also by different ways of working and different priorities that have shifted. But that I want to go back to the education part, because it starts with the education and obviously evolves back to up towards space. But tell us again a little bit about what 21st century education means and what you are doing to rethink education, especially from the earlier stages, but also all life cycles or life stages in terms of continuous education.
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. And I apologize, I missed a little bit of what Ray said, but the last part I heard was fascinating. I wish that you had gotten more contentious panelists, because I've agreed with everything that the panelists have said so far. So the Center for 21st Century Universities really does study factors affecting education and how it'll be changed going forward. And then we try to design and test interventions to position us to be ready to deal with those. Education is really inextricably tied to work in many ways. And initially, our center focused only on higher education, but we've realized increasingly that that's not sufficient. So if you look at Georgia Tech, for example, the incoming freshmen have on average something like 13 to 15 AP classes when they come in. So they generally come in as sophomores. And so we've realized we need to be much more engaged with students early on. Let me tie in. I'll give you some specific examples, but let me tie in a little bit to what I've heard the other folks say. If you think about the sort of global nature of it, it's clear to us that education has to be have a global component as well. So a couple of weeks ago, the Atlanta Global Studies Center had an event on growing international virtual exchange, which I believe they're a co-sponsor of this event. And we recognize that is really important. At Georgia Tech, over 50% of our students have a study abroad experience, and we like that number to rise. But that's abnormal in higher education. Most students don't get that much, and in many universities, students don't have the opportunity to do that. That's not the way the world is going to work. And so you think about one possibility for how work is going to get done. We're getting to a point where we're going to take complex problems and divide them into 1,000 pieces. Then we're going to recruit 1,000 people from around the world to work on those little pieces of the problems, and then we're going to assemble their solutions back into one overall solution. Well, you don't want someone to have their first global experience being faced with that complex of a situation. And so we think it's very important that we get students to benefit and learn from their peers globally right now. One project that we do, we're working on, is something called the Living Library for Learning. And this is where we take people who have a lived experience in a certain area from around the world, and we sort of make them available like books that our students and classes can check out and learn from. So our thinking on this kind of started with the Fukushima reactor meltdown in Japan. We send a group of students there every year. We did before the pandemic. And, maybe 10 or 12 students would go and they would study this. But it's very expensive. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to do this program off. We realize there are engineers working now that worked on that very problem. What if we can then simulate the Fukushima reactor meltdown, have that live in a virtual space, and at the same time have real engineers who solved that problem interact with our students, give them firsthand experience. So we try to use technology to really bridge some of these gaps that we find that let us do things you couldn't do otherwise. One other thing, and I apologize I got so many great ideas listening earlier. Thinking about space and the way space works with learning. We have co-learning, co-working spaces, but we also think it's important to have co-learning spaces. So right now we have some online Master of Science programs in computer science, analytics, and cybersecurity. And these programs are very inexpensive. It's about $7,000 for an entire master's degree. They currently have about 16,000 students around the world in these programs. So it's an online program, but we find the students still like to get together. If the students are in any sort of geographic proximity to each other, they'll drive or take trains or however they can are pretty good ways to actually physically meet up, because the networking is very important to them and the building those connections and bonds for later on. Well, we are now got a project called the Atrium where we are trying to facilitate this by building co-learning spaces where students in degree programs, multiple degree programs, even from multiple universities, can all get together and still do their online degree program, but at the same time build these networks of other learners going on. So just overall, I would say that the notion of interdependency is one that is critical to solve the complex problems of the world, like climate change, for example, and one that we really are trying to support.
Steve, I'm glad you brought up Atrium, because I think that's the perfect connection with what Ray's been talking about in terms of the changes of space. But can you just expand a little bit about what the Atrium is for our listeners that aren't familiar?
Yeah, so Atrium, like I said, is a co-learning space. In geography, there used to be something called distance decay. And distance decay held that the further apart people are, the less interactions they have. That makes sense in a pre-internet world. But when the internet came along, everyone said, oh, geography is dead, distance decay is dead, that now we can interact with people all the time. But after a lot of studies over the last decade, it turns out it's not dead. The slope of interaction declines, but people still interact more often with people they're close to. So as we go out and talk to our learners, we find that they really do have a need for engagement beyond just what occurs in the classroom. If you think about online learning, one of the things that it misses right now are the 5 minutes before class and the 5 minutes after class. And that's when the students talk to each other, they get to know each other, they build networks, they build connections. So the Atrium really is a space to help us facilitate that. We don't think the Atrium will be just a Georgia Tech co-learning space. It'll be open for a variety of people who are doing online programs, much the way we work, for example, was a co-working space where students could get together in one space while they work for different companies. We would see students, say, from Georgia Tech or MIT or Harvard, who are doing different online programs, being in the same room, even though they're studying different things. And Deborah, I don't need to drag on too long, but let me just add one other notion here. We don't limit learning just to our 18 to 24-year-olds. We think it's increasingly important to engage adult learners, because if we look at the world of work, it's rapidly changing and will continuously rapidly change. And so we think it's a little, I hate to use the word naive, but maybe a little naive to think that you can get a higher education degree when you're 18 to 24-year-old and expect that to last you the next 40 or 50 years of work. So we see a continuous engagement with our lifetime learners.
Thank you, Steve. So many questions, and I can't wait to start bouncing questions between the panelists as well to start the conversation. But before I do that, let me turn back to Vanessa for Felix's question.
Perfect. Thank you, Deborah. And Steve, we're going to have to connect because I need to know more about this living library. and to know how you are selecting these various individuals and these various topics. So definitely going to
I would love to.
So Felix, now that we're talking about this living library, right? You are an author. You have established this company called Work Awesome, which is in Berlin, which is in New York. You've had the opportunity, you focus on the future of work. You've had the opportunity of speaking with various experts on this topic. So, I want to pick your brain. I want first for you to talk a little bit more about Work Awesome. I also want you to talk a little bit how you've pivoted into this virtual platform with Remote Daily. And then I just really want to know, what is something tangible that the audience can take away from this conversation? Because when we're talking about the future of work, there's so many layers to it. And we can talk all day, but I really want to know, what do you foresee to be the common focus for cities around the world when it comes to the future of work? And has this timeline shifted, given the fact that now we're in this pandemic? Has it accelerated all the conversations that we've had? And you and I had the opportunity of meeting one another during the Wunderbar together and the panel discussion around Work Awesome. And so I'm very happy that you're able to join us here today and to get your perspective on this. So please let us know more about Work Awesome, Remote Daily, and what are those key topics that we need to learn about as we all work together around the world on this topic.
Wow, thank you, Vanessa. I so appreciate the question. Just as any small business owner, it was a very tough year for us. Everything we do, conferences, learning journeys, workshops, seminars, it got all canceled in a matter of a week. And just like other small businesses, we made lemonade out of lemons. So we decided to show up for our business-centric community every day on Zoom for 60 minutes and build it into a Zoom talk show and experience called Remote Daily. We have learned over the last couple of months how to include live music, meditation, mindfulness, live interviews with people like Mark Cuban and others, and networking in a virtual space. And it was very tough for me, I have to tell you, not only from a professional perspective, but especially from just a human perspective with 2 young children at home. My wife has a full-time job as well. She supported me a great deal. And we now, as a small company, as a small team, have wrapped up over 100 episodes of Remote Daily and are now starting other organizations to build their own virtual formats, enable real talk online, build community, allow for serendipity and well-being in a virtual space, and of course learn together as we do here today. And from hosting over 100 interviews over the past 6 months, I learned a lot, and I'm excited to share a few learnings here with you that might be useful for the audience. What's so fascinating about this year to me is how the virus put all our problems, societal, but really also in the workplace, in front of us like an open book. We look at them together right now simultaneously. We struggle with the fact that work has never been more intertwined with our personal lives. It has never been more uncertain. It has never had a greater effect on our children. We all struggle with the way that privileged white folks like me maybe don't find the right words to talk to their black colleagues, and I include myself here, but I have to sit with that discomfort and figure it out. And we all marvel how, fast industries have completely disappeared and others grow like crazy. I mean, who would have thought that Zoom or Blue Jeans today, a complicated video conferencing app for businesses, are our new social media platforms where weddings, funerals, and anything in between takes place, right? So a lot of the future of work has really moved into the present for a moment. And when you ask me about tangible takeaways, I would like to first focus on cities, as you said. I am a bi-continental person. I have the privilege to travel and be in Europe right now, but my hometown is New York. I've been living there for 8 years. New York's taxes come mainly from real estate, about 53%, with companies cutting down their spendings on workspace. Where is that going to come from in the future? And what does that effect of shrinking office demand and businesses travel less have on all the small businesses that geographically or otherwise depend on the sub-economies of the office to be vibrant? With people moving away from the dense centers of cities, what effect does that have on gentrification? In New York, prices in Manhattan went down, prices in Brooklyn for housing went up. So as community leaders, I can only say keep your small businesses alive, keep arts alive, feed the families that are struggling, and make bold plans right now. Because I think New York, with all its resilience, and other places like Atlanta have a great chance to get better, to open up spaces for young people, for artists, for immigrants, and for just folks with smaller budgets. and also for becoming greener, for introducing more sustainable ways of living. We have just heard about some of these, approaches. And maybe there's also going to be less nursing homes, which have proven in this pandemic to be the worst places to be, and more intergenerational living, not only learning, right? So hopefully there's going to be more of that, and more bicycles and less cars. I say that as a European. And I hope that the wonderful Atlanta Beltline that I have had the chance to see and to experience, the New York City High Line and the LA River, and all these great projects that are examples of resilience, of community work, and circular economies, will be looked at actually things to do more in the future, not anomalies that have sprung up out of a lot of resistance. So I think that is sort of what I've learned about cities over the last couple of months. And now for what you're saying about being very tangible, like having tangible takeaways. Let's go into our personal workspace, because certainly there is a leap in regards to remote work. Everybody has done it now. Everybody had to admit that it is possible. But I learned that while we're all working from home, we're not working remotely. The remote experts that are interviewed, they say working remotely is not what we do. Working remotely would mean we would have a choice and work from anywhere according to our preferences. We do not have that choice right now. So what's missing in the remote work equation right now is not only other geographical places or settings, it is actually also the office that is missing. So right now in this October 2020, we're only at the tip of the iceberg of what remote work actually is or can be. And to make it more complicated, we will look in the next few months and weeks, we will look at hybrid teams and hybrid organizations, where there's going to be a mix between people who will go back to the office and others don't. So the UN, for instance, one of the largest bureaucratic organizations in the world, is one of many that is trying out right now how to figure out hybrid, and is encountering a lot of challenges. We just had a UN employee on our remote daily show the other day from Geneva describing utter chaos around her while they're trying to go into this hybrid model. And the hardest thing about being hybrid, building a hybrid team, a hybrid organization, is that it actually has to be built remotely from the beginning. So only if it's fully functioning as a remote organization, then you can build a hybrid element, an in-person element into it. So teams and organizations need to really start building a strong remote framework with rules and boundaries. And whether the suggestion of a federal law, as it is being discussed right here in Germany, in my native country right now, is the way to go forward, I don't know. I think this needs to be discussed. But every team and every individual has to come up with rules and boundaries for remote work to move forward. Secondly, I think when you look at the mental state of work, so our way of working from home over the past months has produced more efficiency, has produced more output, has produced more working hours, but it had grueling side effects. And I'm not only saying this as a dad, as a father that worked at home. Almost all elements of culture, of the soul of a team or an organization went down. There's a grand disconnect. IBM just put out a report saying that 74% of employers think they're helping their team learn the skills they need for our new world of work. And only 38 of employees agree with that. And the perceptions in that survey aren't great on health investments either. So as an employer, you have some serious repair work to do. Your employees struggle with blurred lines between work and life. Your new hires and interns struggle with the fact that onboarding for them means getting shipped a laptop to their homes, and there's no way to shadow you, to learn from you as it used to be, and they don't know what they actually belong to. And all of us are missing out, of course, on serendipity, right? The casual conversation, the talk without a job title, without an agenda. So I urge you all to step up, take some of the money you may have now saving, you may now save from the office spaces that you used to have to pay for, and invest it in better home office supplies, in connectivity for your employees, and in experiences in the virtual space that are better, than just a happy hour on Zoom, that produce more than just to-do lists, or that actually give people a space to be vulnerable and to learn and to have tough conversations around change, around screen time, around everything that is really at our hearts right now, with your leadership involved, and that makes people belong and feel progressive again. That is what I set out to do this year, and I can see it every day that more and more leaders finally turn to their employees and say, coming out of this crisis, what can I really do for you? And the biggest impact, maybe as a last point, the people who are suffering the most are the smallest and most vulnerable among us, the children. In developing countries, this is also a number from the UN, there's an estimated 1 billion kids out of school right now, missing on an average 4 months of school this year, while in more developed countries, you're more talking about 5 to 6 weeks of school they have been missing. So this report just came out yesterday by UN. And of course, the biggest problem most kids have this year around the world is actual connectivity. So it doesn't only mean to share an account. In my parents' house, for instance, there's only one Zoom call possible at a time. No, it actually means a lot of kids do not even have access to a device, access to internet. And I'm not talking about Papua New Guinea here. I'm talking about the UK, US, and it's the problem is smaller there, but it's really everywhere. And the UN wants to make connectivity a children's right, sort of a human right for the younger folks to inhabit this planet. And I think this year has just shown how dramatically important that will be in the future. So make sure the kids in your communities have access, and yes, maybe let the big tech firms help you to provide that, is I think a last point I wanted to make.
Felix, thank you. I think you bring up a lot of very important points. Mental health is not something that we had thought to talk about today, but I think it's imperative that we discuss it as well. And as everyone has mentioned as well, the digital divide, as you mentioned, is not just in Papua New Guinea, it's also in our own backyards. So it goes back to what Mohammed said, connecting the global and the local. And it's also when it comes to urban design, when it comes to education, all of these are factors that are very important for us to make sure there's equity, diversity, and inclusion. My follow-up question to you, Felix, is where is that North Star? As we're all trying to see which way to go, who do you think has really implemented a strategy that has been thinking about their employees, that has been thinking about the digital divide, that we can look at so we can start to exchange best practices and be able to move forward?
Wow, Vanessa, I wish I could give you a good answer to that and say, look at this organization or look at that company or community. But frankly, I don't know. I don't see anybody right now that has all the pieces together, because so many of us are not planning as we usually do for a year ahead right now in Q3 going to Q4. We're just looking at next Tuesday. And most of my peers don't even have a plan B for next Tuesday. So I really don't have a good answer for you here on my end, but I would love to actually give this question back to the panel and see if there's anybody else who says, yes, there's maybe a company or an organization on my radar that I see as a real idol in this time to look up to.
Thank you, Felix. And I think it's also a great opportunity when we're thinking about partnerships with the educational institutions, the businesses, the cities, civic leaders, health experts. Really what this pandemic has showcased is how we can all come together and come up with some sort of plan. And like you mentioned, we don't even know what's going to happen. We didn't even know we were going to have a storm, a week ago. So there's all these things that are always moving around, and we're just quickly adapting. So I'm curious to continue this conversation to see what it is that we can learn from one another, because it's true, it's not going to be a quick solution, and it's not going to be a short-term solution. We got to look at this very, very long-term. And as you also know, Felix, now that you're in Germany, Europe is experiencing the second wave. And so there's the lockdowns that are coming. So it's also something that we need to consider again, back to the mental health piece. So thank you, Felix, for sharing all your insights. Deborah, back to you.
Vanessa.
You're welcome.
Yeah, let me just remind the audience, if you want to type in your questions, feel free to type them on the Q&A or in the event chat box, and we're happy to answer them. Obviously, we have a pretty diverse panel here that, there's so many facets that we can talk about for the future of work. But a common theme that I'm hearing across all four panelists, and I think, Mohammed, you spoke of it as a certain amount of flexibility. Flexibility for young people, flexibility in the space, flexibility in terms of your work that Felix obviously has, and he's practicing it right now, given the fact that he's in a car and doing the webinar. So, that flexibility in terms of the car becoming part of the workspace. And then, of course, Steve's research in terms of how it affects your traditional education. It's no longer just sitting in front of a classroom and listening to a professor. You can actually learn it from your peers. You can learn it in different places. But, Mohammed, I'll start with you, but for all of our panelists, flexibility, to me, is something that you have to learn, and it takes time to build flexibility. So what actually needs to happen now in order to kind of build that flexibility or resilience in order to achieve it, so we can get there? Or what are the mechanisms that can be done in practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and I think it really depends on your line of work. So I'll share in my context with the Stevens Initiative, we see ourselves as a field builder for the virtual exchange field. We want to mainstream this practice into classrooms. So as we are thinking about our 2021 work, right? So we're in the middle of a grant competition right now. We are looking to potentially fund models of virtual exchange that are going to maybe be able to meet students given the context of where we're in. So my team that's reviewing applications will be considering things like that. With regards to our events, some events we know are going to be completely online. We usually have an annual forum where we bring folks together. We've had to push that back until fall 2021. Usually that's a spring event. But even then, we're thinking, okay, what if we're unable to convene in fall 2021? So we have, we're considering a plan B. Does it mean that we completely go hybrid, or do we go online? Do we break up a 2-day event into multiple small events over the course of the year? In terms of our grant making, this past summer we had a small coronavirus rapid response grant competition, and we were looking for programs that were going to be flexible and meet students where they are. As a grant maker, we also look at the definition of a participant, and we recognize that a student may not be in a classroom all semester, right, or have a full semester or a full 12-week experience or an 8-week experience according to a program. So even as a grant maker, we've had to be flexible and work with our partners to find a suitable definition of a participant in the case, that maybe students are only online 40% of the time, and that's maybe a bit of the synchronous activities, but maybe some of the virtual exchange activities are asynchronous that allow for lower bandwidth. So we're in constant communication with our partners to try to understand what the reality is on the ground, where we can mitigate issues, and where we can find sort of common ground that'll meet both of our operational realities and both of our goals in terms of what we are accountable for to our stakeholders. So it does require a lot of rolling up your sleeves, a lot of flexibility, a lot of also cutting through. Sometimes you have definitions and you're like, well, why is this the standard? Who said that X amount of contact hours is the right thing? Can we try some different things? And if anything, maybe the pandemic gives you an opportunity to cut through some of that noise and question some of your initial notions. I think to Felix's point, there's no right answer. And I think we're all trying to figure it out. So at least with my team and our colleagues and our partners that we work with, we do approach it at a very human sort of level of like, hey, we realize everybody's just trying to figure this out. Let's have some grace with one another, but also be very clear about what's important to our stakeholders. So.
Ray and Steve, thoughts on flexibility, how you can actually build and instill flexibility in the now?
I'll jump in quickly and say that I think it goes back to the purpose of education, and I think it's something that we in education need to confront a little more strongly. So is education a public good or a private good? If it's a private good, then you kind of train students for their first job, and it's to the benefit of the individual. But if education is a public good, then really you're training students to be better citizens, and that sort of training makes them more flexible. And I think sort of the core education, in some ways the liberal arts education, is designed to teach people to be flexible. And so we've got to maintain a balance of giving students skills that they need to succeed in the workplace, but also these broader life skills that give them the flexibility and the curiosity to be lifelong learners.
Well, I'm going to talk about from my perspective, the most important things are things like teaching people to be, empowering them to be better at residents, citizens, et cetera, in the way that the society works today. And, in my world, that can be in planning, and that like we now have a new generation of planning approaches, whether through eco-districts or other methods, where you actually not only engage people in a curriculum, but you even pay them to participate in the curriculum, because we recognize that otherwise the kind of empowered citizen is only limited to folks with enormous resources, and so are significant resources. So I think that there's all kinds of ways in which it's really an education message. It's like that there had to keep the flexibility going. The only way that really works is if people choose, because in the end, as much as I want to see default decisions made healthy for people, in the end, people do have some agency, and they will make choices that either work or don't work in this new economy, that are healthy or not healthy, and that work with financially or not. But again, that's going to take a sort of a big idea of training and a big idea of education and a big idea of citizenship, for lack of a better term, that's going to be what we need for people. And I think and universities are going to be part of that. I think that when universities try to really meet the SDGs, which they are, I think your university is, ours is, the city of Pittsburgh is, when you try and really meet those SDGs and you look through the 17 items, you're going to have to figure out a way to get more education to more people, and education that has a feeling of co-production and co-creation, because what it's doing is empowering people to do the co-creation and co-production of shaping their environments. People need to stand up and say what they want in their workplace, not just what they are told is going to be their workplace. And the only way that people can do that is when they know options and they know how to work the system, for lack of a better term. That's how change will happen. So that's how I look at it.
And I think that is a good close-in to close with the UN SDGs as a really important platform and foundation for the future of work. I'll let Vanessa close, and then obviously I want to thank all our panelists. Thank you to our co-sponsors, especially the Atlanta Global Study Center and our other Georgia Smart partners. But, thank you for each of our panelists' resilience, especially this morning in our audience. Webinar is recorded, so if you want to circle back and listen to different parts, feel free to. But thank you so much to my fellow moderator, Vanessa.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, everyone. And again, it's incredible to see how really resilient we are during these challenging times, even today. In the car, in a phone call, lighting, we're trying to all figure it out. And as has been repeatedly said, we don't have the answers, we don't have the solution, but I think what's really important to showcase here is that we're all willing to virtually, or hopefully one day in person, draw up a plan to come up with some solutions. And this is going to be discussed for many, many years and many, many educational institutions. So thank you all for coming here today. We love partnering with you all, and have a wonderful day. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.